All right, I'm here with Gabe Wyner. Gabe, thanks for taking the time to chat.
Thanks for having me.
Right, we've got a lot to talk about, man. It's
Yeah.
we haven't we were just saying before we started that we haven't had the chance to chat much up to this point. So I know we've got a lot of areas of mutual interest. So it's going to be
Yeah.
good to dive into those. So for the benefit, first of all, of those people who maybe are not so familiar with you or your work, could you give us a little bit of a linguistic run through of your
Just how my stuff works.
yeah.
Sure. Let's see. This whole thing kind of started in 2010. Let's see. I wrote a book in 2014, or at least it came out in 2014, and that's where my blog is coming from and all that. The source of the book is from 2010. I had this experience of screwing myself over in French. I had already done, I'd learned a couple of languages through Immersion. I did the Middlebury, Vermont language school programs for German twice, and then I went over to Italy to learn Italian. And
Is that because it
those
didn't
were
work the first time, or because you wanted to go back for more?
because I wanted to go back for more. Yeah, I got to like B1 or B2 by the first after 7 weeks of this program. They're just phenomenal programs, and I had nothing. I walked in there with like 0 words of German. They're just such good programs. And then I wanted to get up to C1, C2, and so I got up to C1 by the end of the second summer. Went to Italy, didn't have as good of an experience. I mean, I had an amazing experience. Italy's an amazing country, but like from a learning standpoint, in Middlebury, people are forbidden from speaking English. In Italy, they're not. So
Yeah.
from a learning standpoint, the Vermont experience was sort of better, and so I wanted to go back to Vermont for French. And I didn't know French, but I wanted to. They had a level 1.5 for false beginners, and I thought that seems probably about right given my Italian background. I can probably study a little bit of French before I get there. Like I want to be in level 1.5. And so they had an online placement test, and I just cheated as hard as I could because I figured, 0 French plus Google Translate equals like level 1.5.
Right.
And unfortunately, I cheated too well, and so they sent me 3 months before the program started. They said, "Hey, congratulations, you've gotten to the intermediate level, level 2. Once you arrive, we'll do an interview with you entirely in French and make sure that you didn't do something stupid like cheat." And so I panicked and I started looking around online and I found Anki. I found spaced repetition.
Yeah.
And I saw what people were doing with it, and I knew from previous failures with learning language for myself that like if I were to use translations there, I would be stuck in the same stuff that I did before. I really didn't react well to learning language through translation. And I saw how well it worked in Middlebury, where I was like, okay, if I use 0 words of English, I can learn this thing really fast. And so I sort of adapted Anki to use with exclusively in French. Initially, I was learning simple picture words. Here's a chat, here's a chien, dog and cat and stuff. And I was just like using pictures. And eventually, I built up a vocabulary and started interacting those words together and saying, okay, well, the dog's chasing the cat. Like, let's start dealing with this thing. And using closed deletions, using fill in the blank sentences. But still keeping it exclusively in French. And I had some French background going into this in the sense of I used to be an opera singer. And so I had French pronunciation down already, which was a nice head start. And so I did this Anki thing for 3 months for an hour a day. And I showed up in this program, and I hadn't spoken any French before this interview, and I found that I could speak French. And it totally just surprised the shit out of me. It was just like, what? I understand what you're saying, and I know what to say back. And it wasn't fluent, and it wasn't comfortable, but it was like, I'm thinking in French at this point. And the interviewer was like, oh, you speak French. You shouldn't be in the intermediate level. You should be in the advanced level. And so, like, they bumped me up one more level. I read a bunch of books, and I hit C1 by the end of that summer. And I sort of came out of that, like, reeling, being like, what was this? What just happened? Like, this is new. And so I started writing about it, and that turned into an article that went viral on Lifehacker, and turned into a book, and then turned into this whole life, which is now just devoted towards making language learning products and things.
Fantastic.
So
that all happened to you in quite a short space of time, didn't it? That's
super short.
Yeah, because I remember reading that you have a background in music, which I do as well. I mean, I trained as a pianist in London, and of course not much singing involved in in that. But although we did do some singing, but I wondered whether as a singer you had language classes, or I mean, you must have had some familiarity with the languages.
Absolutely, yeah.
As a singer, no formal instruction, or how did it work?
There's some. As a singer, the technical requirements for my degree were I needed to take 1 semester of each language and 2 semesters of 1 semester of French, Italian, German, and then an additional semester of one of them. I passed out of my German requirement because Middlebury. The French one I took at a summer school. I took 1 semester of community college, and so that was sort of the background there. In terms of how much you get out of a thing like that, I felt like not very much. But we did have diction courses, and so we took, in addition to those things, we took French pronunciation for a half semester, Italian pronunciation, German pronunciation, English pronunciation. And so my sense of the phonetic system of French was solid by then. So like, yeah, that was the sort of language background at that point. I feel like at that point, yeah.
I was going to say, I guess, because when you mentioned English diction, I mean, the way that you pronounce words when you're singing English is not the way that you pronounce them when you're speaking English. So I wonder,
yes,
to what extent when you first started speaking French, you spoke like an opera singer.
Like an opera singer, yeah, absolutely, yeah, like, totally. Definitely feasible. I'm trying to think. I felt like to some extent, like for one, all the vowels and the consonants are going to be the same. They're going to be over-enunciated, but still the sounds are going to be, I'll be familiar with the sounds. If you're coming from a singing background, you'll be familiar with all the appropriate sounds at that point.
And that's the big task, isn't it? Because, reception has to come before production, right? So you have to, I think for a lot of people, when they're trying to get to grips with the pronunciation of a language, the issue is not so much that they can't say it, but they can't hear it. Whereas, if you've been through a whole musical training program, you spent so much time listening to the music that you should have a fairly good understanding of the kind of ballpark how stuff should be pronounced and how stuff should sound.
Well, the nice thing with the opera background is that aside from just having classes where someone is telling you what you're supposed to do, there's a lot of interaction. And so you get to have sort of this coach there where you say a line in French and they're like, no, not quite. Right. You said, bonjour, and I want bonjour. And then they're like, okay, so how about bonjour? And they're like, oh, almost, but bonjour. And you get this back and forth. And that's, I think, primarily where you kind of learn it, as opposed to just saying, here are the items of French pronunciation. I think you get it through this interaction. Right.
So let's talk about the methodology then, because you've had a fantastic experience. Sure. I mean, I've looked at the Middlebury courses and they look wonderful. They're not cheap, for sure.
No, they're not. They have good financial aid, though. Actually, it's an important thing for people to realize. Like, they look at this thing, like the price tags at this point are like $10,000, maybe more. Yeah. But if you apply as early as you can, like, they will pay for most of that.
Oh, really?
So, like, that's just a good thing for people who are out there who look at this and they balk at the price. Like, it could be cheap.
Yeah. It's a fantastic experience to have gone through by all accounts. I mean, I'd love to do it myself, just to see. I mean, it sounds like much better than going to live abroad on so many different levels, because the number of times I've been abroad to learn a language and ended up just fighting not to speak English with people, and then trying to find people to talk to, and so I guess you go into this place and you just get like you say, you're banned from speaking English. I mean, it sounds like an experience. I mean, without going through it, it's difficult to say whether it would work for me, but 7 weeks, right?
There's 7 weeks for the languages that share the same alphabet as English, and then 8 weeks for the ones that don't.
Right. So at the very least, you get almost 2 months of very intensive exposure. It sounds great. So then, in terms of like what I'd like to ask is how you think about language learning now in terms of methodology. I mean, I know obviously you've written a book and you speak about different approaches to learning on your website. But how do you, if you were to sort of sit down with someone and have a cup of coffee and try to explain to them how an adult can learn a language, what are the kind of big milestones or big sort of buckets that you have to touch on?
I look at language as a memory game. primarily.
Okay.
That the biggest, I would say two main things. Well, a lot of main things, but two sort of organizing principles. That there's a general myth that children are really good at learning languages and adults are terrible at it. And there's a lot of reasons for why people believe this thing. Because you go to France and you're struggling with French and you've been working on it for years and you see this 5-year-old who speaks better French than you and you're like, like you didn't work. I worked and you're correcting my grammar. Like what the hell? But it's like an optical illusion in some sense. Like that kid has had 20,000 hours of French and you've had like 200. And of course that kid's beating you at French. But there are some really nice studies sort of isolating that and saying, okay, well, what happens if we control for time? And you take a kid with 500 hours of exposure, an adult with 500 hours of exposure, who wins? And it's the adult that wins every time.
Every time, yeah.
Yeah. And it's like we're smarter than kids. Like we've learned to be smarter. Like that's the whole point of growing up. And so we actually share, we never lose that ability to pick up language. We have a really good facility for it. And from my standpoint, the only thing in anyone's way as an adult is time and is memory. Is that by the time that if you're learning a language an hour a week, or 2 hours a week, or you're taking a class for 3 hours a week even, and you do this thing for a semester, like by the end of that semester, you've forgotten the first half of the semester. And then you take your second semester and you've forgotten the first semester, and then you've taken your third semester and you've likely forgotten much of what you've learned. And so if you can fix that, if you can recall every single thing that you want and keep it in there, then your brain's going to do just fine in terms of piecing that into fluent language. I think that machinery is that kids use is just as active, if not more active, as an adult. And so my approach is really all about dealing with that memory issue. And so I sort of build it in layers. I build this sort of spelling and pronunciation layer first, because I usually bring up this example from Hungarian. The word for camera is fényképezőgép, and it's like, what?
Yeah.
It's a word that you cannot retain if you haven't had some familiarity with Hungarian. Like it's just
it sounds like nothing else. Yeah.
Yeah. And like that's not unique to Hungarian. Like that's in every single language. You're going to have sounds that are unfamiliar, and they're going to make those words very difficult to remember. We've all had experiences of like walking into a party and we meet people with familiar names, and then someone's like says their name, and you're like, I don't know what you just said. Like, can you repeat that? And they'll repeat it as much as that you ask them to, and you still won't recall their name because it's involving sounds that you're not familiar with. And so from my standpoint, that's the first barrier. If you can't hear it, then you won't be able to remember it very well. And so you take care of that, and that's been my last 4 years of work, has been making that easier, has been developing these apps for that thing. But once you take care of the pronunciation level, like that hasn't solved everything. That's just gotten rid of the first barrier. And so the next parts are about how can you most efficiently build associations into your words. There's an example I tend to use with a word like dog, for instance. Like I have thousands, maybe millions of images in my head or word associations with the word dog. Dog is associated with every dog I've ever seen. It's associated with words like cat and pet and tail and bark. It has its own grammar. Like, I walked my dog. It's a strange construction. All that stuff is built into the word dog, and then as soon as I say something like, oh yeah, well the Hungarian word for dog is kutya, then like it's as if I told you something, but I haven't. Like, you have very little associated with the word kutya. Right now you have like one association built in. If I say kutya, you don't necessarily think of your childhood pet or the Hungarian word for tail, because you don't even know it yet. Like all these sorts of, like, how would you make those associations unless you decide, okay, well, I'm going to consciously build them.
So you mean it's an abstract, as a word, it's an abstract thing with no particular meaning for you other than the sound that it happens to be, the way it happens to sound or the way it happens to be written. There's nothing beyond that. Very one-dimensional type object.
It has a single association to the sound of the English word dog, not even to the meaning of it. You've just associated two sounds. I say dog, you say kutya. I say kutya, you think dog, but you don't think about like fur or like brown or cute or anything like that. Like those are not built in. Those you have to make a jump to get to. And so from my standpoint, what I'm looking for is, okay, well, if I want kucha to be associated with a word like forok, tail, or to be just associated with images of dogs, then I want that to be what I'm looking at on a daily basis. And so I use spaced repetition to kind of build that stuff in and say, okay, well, I want to embed this in a sentence and use fill in the blanks so that this word kucha is associated with the words that usually go around dog.
Okay. Sure.
But in Hungarian, and then also associated with images.
So what you've described is if I'm understanding correctly, is basically a very heavy focus on vocabulary acquisition I
use vocabulary acquisition in the service of grammar in some sense. I only learn grammar in the context. Only is a strong word. 80% of the grammar that I'm learning is in the context of sentences and is in the context of stories. Sure. And so if I'm going to be learning something like how to conjugate, walk, I walked my dog in the past. Yesterday I walked my dog. Then I'm not going to be learning things in the abstract like I blank and then conjugate the verb to walk past tense. Like from my standpoint, it's sort of dry and very, very abstract. Whereas if I do the exact same thing, but I just stick in the word dog afterwards, I walked my dog, or I have yesterday, I walked my dog, then I can do basically the exact same exercise, but I can attach it to a story. I can stick in a picture of, a dog getting walked. Mm-hmm. And if I have a fill in the blank where I'm doing I blank my dog, in parentheses it says to walk, and then, past, and it has a picture of someone walking their dog, in some sense it looks like an abstract grammatical exercise again. But on another sense, you're using it to tell a story. And I think that makes a huge difference, both in terms of how it's internalized and how easy it is to retain.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, especially if you're seeing it within context, and that context is linked to something like a story, which is obviously, in a way, it's kind of a surrogate for lived experience that you don't have, right? I mean,
exactly.
You can't remember, you don't have that experience of walking a dog in your Hungarian life, but you can get close to that perhaps, or you can substitute that some way by actually having the story and having the pictures and the images. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We've gone quite deep in already, haven't we? I'd like to just pull it back at just a second and talk about that part of the process. I've been thinking a lot about, I've just been in the Montreal Language Festival, and I've been these events are always interesting, because you just kind of, I find it's the only time that I get to sort of take a step back and actually think about learning in general on a level that you don't when you're kind of heads down immersed in your work. And we had lots of discussions. A lot of language people came together and talked about their approaches to learning and all that stuff. So I'm very it's on my mind at the moment. So to what extent is talk to me about the link between your experience at Middlebury in the immersion programs and the focus on vocabulary that you've just described. I mean, did you learn? And the sort of supposition in the question is that Middlebury was extremely effective for you, and it helped you learn very, very quickly. So, is the method that you're describing linked to what you learned at Middlebury? What's the connection there?
Sure. Good question. Yes, I mean, definitely they are linked. And they're linked in the sense that I wasn't aware that you could pick up a language within that language. Like, I came into Middlebury thinking, well, I mean, of course, like, I'm in level 1. Like, of course they're going to give me some English here, right? Like, how am I supposed to learn anything without any German? Like, how are you going to do this to me? And I quickly realized, like, oh no, they're really not going to give me one word of English. Like, I have nothing, and you're going to give me nothing in my native language. And yet I watched myself learn. I watched everyone else around me learn. I mean, there was no one who got left behind.
What was the curve like? Is it a gradual curve? Because I imagine it must, in many ways, it must be like a hockey stick sort of thing, where it's like really hard at first, and then because at first you don't understand anything, and there's no mediation of that lack of understanding. But then there must come a point where stuff just starts to click, right? So is it like a kind of
I
reverse hockey
mean,
stick type thing, or?
no, it's just hard the whole time.
Right. Okay.
I mean, it's really hard. It's hard initially. It's hard in different ways all the way through. There's a thing they talk about called the black hole, that happens at around week 5, where you forget you hit points where you've been out of English for so long that you lose the ability to to think in English very well. And so you start running into sentences where you want to say a concept and you realize you don't remember how to say it in your native language and you don't know how to say it in your target language. And it's the most spectacularly stressful thing in the world.
Right.
Where you're just like, I am broken. Initially, you're constantly sort of thinking in English, and yet you have this gag order on you where you're like, I want to say this thing and I can't. And that's stressful. And then it's sort of this gradual shift in between that stress to this black hole stress. And then eventually you get past it. I would say, yeah, past week 5. Once you get past that point where you've hit that black hole stress and it's gotten a little bit better and you can like, okay, now I can really kind of think in German. It gets a little bit easier, but all the way through, I would say the stress of immersion is really very particular. Like it's difficult and it doesn't go away when you're really not allowed to express yourself in your native language.
It's interesting because stress is often thought of as one of the big counter indicators of efficient learning, of effective learning. You know.
Good point.
But having said that, you know, with language learning being just such an exercise in just building up that knowledge base and that threshold and that comfort existing in that world. It absolutely stands to reason that immersion will get you there, even if it hurts a little bit along the way.
Yes.
Yeah.
No. I mean, one of the things that was sort of remarkable about the Middlebury thing was watching other people. Like, you could watch your own experience and be like, "Wow, this is a weird thing I'm going through." But you're looking around, you're like, "Wait, everyone is advancing at the same level here, and it's a very, very rapid level." I never actually answered, I don't think, your question in terms of its relationship to what I currently do. I think the thing of seeing how that was possible, I think, was what sort of led to what I do right now. The idea that, like, wait, I actually could do this without English was a new concept to me. And then in playing with it, I started realizing, wait, this is working. Like, let's keep trying this. Let's see how far we can go. And that's kind of where my methodology came from.
Okay, so am I right in thinking that you enjoy having an approach with flashcards whereby you like to keep it 100% in the target language?
On the flashcards, yes. During the creation process, I'm okay with using translations.
Okay, I see. And so that's kind of born out of your experience with the immersion and the fact that you learned so effectively without. I mean, are you essentially? It's your thought process essentially saying, okay, well, I didn't, when I learned these languages, I did it without English. Therefore, why use English now?
That was the initial source of it.
Is that an accurate characterization? Or?
Yes. That was definitely the initial source of why I went in that direction. Afterwards, when I started writing the book, the nice thing about the whole book writing process is it's like, okay, here you have a year and a half to figure out, to like sit and do research and figure out, why did this thing work? And so I started going through through a ton of research on how memory works and stuff. And it started building a theoretical basis for, why did this work so well? And maybe I could find changes. And as it turns out, I did. I found ways of looking at the research and saying, oh, wait, here's something I'm missing. There's another way to do this that's even more effective. So at this point, I stand by this thing from a research standpoint and from a sort of like theory of memory standpoint. Back then, it was entirely out of, well, I tried this Middlebury thing. It seems to work. Let's try it again.
Sure.
So that.
Yeah. Okay. We've had a couple of conversations on blog post comments, haven't we, about flashcards, and there's a few people a few of our mutual readers have kind of tried to kind of provoke us in a way, provoke us in a way into sort of debating the best way to use flashcards, and this stemmed from an episode I did a while ago on my podcast, in which I reacted to the idea that that you should you should have images on your flashcards, and that the flashcard should be only in the L2s, only in the target language. And we've sort of gone back and forth a little bit on that, about that in blog posts. But I think my overarching feeling is that, because I'm a big proponent of I love using flashcards as well. They've helped me massively. Yeah. And I think that our two approaches are almost at a point where there's a distinction without a difference, because we're both doing very, very similar things. So I kind of want to go down that rabbit hole and talk about should you the kind of different techniques and approaches to flashcards, but at the same time it's very personal, isn't it? And I think the best, as people that talk about languages and language learning, the best thing we can do is put these ideas out there, and then people kind of they try different things. They try to understand the processes, the rationale behind what we're doing, and then they come to that, they draw their own conclusions.
I've gotten some emails from readers where they've sent me this thing where they're like, I've been doing this thing, I've been like reading the Assimil books or something, and it's been working so well, and I'm speaking the language and stuff, but then I read your book and it's suggesting things that are slightly different. Should I throw away all the stuff that's working really well? Yeah. I'm like, no, do what works. Like, if you're liking this thing, no. I think that people are sometimes so caught up in what is the most optimal way to do something that they can sometimes ignore the thing that's working in front of them.
Yeah, and
do something that's not optimal for them. Yeah.
People want certainty, and I find myself wanting this as well. I mean, I'm a big fan of Steve Kaufman's videos, and I've watched Steve Kaufman for hours, because I love the way he articulates himself. It really resonates with me, and I find myself watching his videos, and I find myself looking for the truth, if you like, such as it is. And even at this stage, with all my, I should be at the point now where I can trust my own experience enough to not give a shit about whatever anyone else says, right? And yet I still find myself looking for those grains of wisdom, specifically for, I guess it's for the things that I'm not, the areas of language learning that I'm not so good at. So for example, if someone were to write an article about how to learn Portuguese, I wouldn't read it, because I learned Portuguese and I don't feel like I did it badly. I'm fairly successful at it, so that's sort of fine. I don't want to read an article about how to learn Portuguese. However, if someone came along and wrote an article on how to progress beyond intermediate Cantonese without knowing Chinese characters, it's like, man, give it to me now. That's what I want. Because that's the thing that I'm struggling with. So if I always try to remind myself of what it's like to be in a position trying to get ahead get started in your first language, your first foreign language, and figuring out what it's like. And it's just a huge black hole. It's a huge unknown, isn't it? Of all these different possibilities and different methods and approaches, and not knowing, having not been done one lap yet of the language learning game, not knowing exactly what's right for you. And I think on that point, I certainly feel like as someone that I write about language, I talk about language learning a lot. I think I probably do sometimes. I probably am guilty of sort of oversimplifying things and in a way, because if you talk about language learning all day, every day, you have to. I think there's always this big danger of having to add 20 caveats to everything that you say, which just doesn't make for compelling listening or reading, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, but everything that you've said, everything that the conversation that we could have about flashcards, for example, since we're on that topic, it has to inevitably come with all these different kind of caveats. Yes. Chief among which is whatever we say, do what works for you. That's the most important thing, right? So I often wondered, the extent to which we kind of help people with the advice that we give, whilst also driving them crazy by suggesting that this is the right way to do things.
Sure. No, it's one thing that I was actually pretty happy about with how the book evolved, is that initially there's a tendency to write a how-to book where you're just like, do this, it works, do it. And eventually the book just turned into the story of how memory works. and just here's what we know about memory, and based on this, like here's an approach that takes that into account. But like I just told you how memory works, so like you can change this. Like you have the flexibility here to say, you know, if this is true, and it is, like this is what we know about the brain, like yeah, Gabe's approach makes some sense, but I want to do this thing, and that makes more sense. And it's like, well, great, like, go do that thing. Like that's, as long as it's consistent with like humans and how we learn things, then anything you do in that realm is going to be effective for you. And it allowed me to shift the focus from here's what you must do to let's talk about this whole concept of learning. Sure. and address it that way. And it just eased a lot of the pressure in terms of being prescriptive. I mean, my method has changed drastically since the book came out. I keep writing new blog posts of being like, hey, I just figured out this new thing. Like, let's try this. Like, let's learn entirely with tutors. Throw away your grammar books. Like, let's see how that works. And all of them are still consistent with how we learn.
How has your method changed since the book?
Initially, the book was very segmented. It was learn pronunciation, learn 625 words using pictures alone. I have this frequency list that's entirely concrete words or concrete verbs, things like that. Then go to your grammar book and learn a bunch of sentences with closed deletions, with fill in the blanks, and pick up the rest of the grammar of the language. Like pick up the grammar of the language because you're not learning any with the words. And then start playing around. Get more words if you want them. Go start reading books. Go watch TV with subtitles in the target language or not. Like start talking to people. Like do the rest of the play part, the fun part, as it were, or the extra fun part. And then Japanese came along and kicked my ass.
Japanese does that to people.
It does. And also I was in a rush in some sense. I could not just learn vocabulary because I needed to learn grammar. And so I pulled out an italki tutor and I was like, hey, I have 0 words of Japanese. This is the word list I want to use. I want to learn these 625 words. The first one is white. Can you help me come up with a sentence that is personal for white? And like we would just go and create sentences for every single one of these words, and I would learn all of my words in the context of those sentences that are personal and relate to memories of my own. And I was like, oh, this is working like way faster than my previous method. And so I've basically combined the grammar book part and the vocabulary part, and I'm just doing all the grammar and vocabulary together. Okay. I still the old method certainly works, and I've gotten a lot of readers sending things back saying, hey, I could speak now 2-3 languages. And I'm like, whoa, you've been busier than I have. But these new approaches, certainly at least for me, interacting with a tutor and having that, like being able to sort of speak and develop sentences from the very first day has been really valuable. I retain a lot more.
Yeah, absolutely. So is Japanese the language you're working on at the moment, or is that a previous project? Or
yes, it was Japanese. Then I had to take a 8-month break to learn Spanish for my wedding, and then Japanese again.
So you're back to Japanese.
Yeah.
Is it your first non-European language?
Yes, I mean unless it depends on how you're counting Hungarian and Russian, because Hungarian is, I don't know, it's in Europe, but
yeah, okay.
As far as I'm concerned, it's from Mars. Like it's
yeah. How has Japanese differed from the other languages you've learned in terms of the learning experience?
The memory burden of learning the characters is spectacular. It easily doubles the difficulty of that language. Having a character system that is that complex and is so unrelated to the sounds or meanings of the words in many ways is unique. I mean, there's nothing like it. Except for the other languages that use the same character set. So, yeah. It introduces just memory problems that are really special and unique to that thing. For this Kickstarter thing that I'm developing now, people are like, oh, why aren't you supporting Japanese for your first languages? And I'm like, well, because we need to develop a whole new system for that. Like, yes, I have to use this thing for my own Japanese at some point, but like, that's going to take development because they're just different. They're different languages than anything else out there.
Yeah, I have a feeling we could talk about that for a very long time. But I want to pick you up on the Kickstarter that you've mentioned because why don't you tell us about it and what's behind it? What is it about? And yeah.
Sure. One of the key chunks of my method is that you are building your own flashcards. That's in some sense necessary. That's the learning stage. Flashcards tend to be really, really good for reviewing information that you've learned, and challenging for learning that information in the first place. And so the learning stage for me, and in this method, is basically you choosing a sentence to learn or a word to learn, and you having a choice in that thing, like you deciding, I want that word. No, I want this word. I want this chunk of grammar. Like that choice is really important. Then you deciding, picking out images that fit with that sentence, that story, or with that word. And then you forming that into flashcards in Anki. And what that does is it creates this sort of personal experience with each of your sentences that makes them easier to retain. And then when you come back and review them, you're remembering that experience, that creation experience. Of, for instance, looking on Google Images and seeing like 30 memes for Spanish dogs or something. You're like, oh, haha, like that's not what I expected to see. Like that's funny. And then every time you see that flashcard again, you feel that haha moment. Like, oh, that I remember that was fun to make. Mm-hmm. That works really well. The problem is that building flashcards takes time. And one of the chief objections to my stuff is like, whoa, that's a lot of work. Like, I don't want to go make 5,000 flashcards. And it's a solid objection. Much of that process, while I think the process is valuable, much of that process is not. Like you typing in the word into Google Images, like the typing process, not super useful. You taking an image and like dragging it into the box in Anki, not super useful. You finding a recording and dragging it around, like also not useful. And
not to mention the bit where you have your decks made and you're trying to import it into the app on your phone and you can't figure out how the hell to do it, and it just happened to me yesterday.
Welcome to my life. Like this is like I used to teach workshops on this method that were around 12 hours long for the workshop, and I would say 6 to 8 hours of those workshops were dealing with the user interface. We're just computer skills, and it's like we're trying to learn languages here, and like 2/3 of this workshop are computer skills. And all of that is unnecessary. And I've known that since before the book came out. It's been since I was doing these workshops. It's like I'm watching these people struggle with this extremely hard to use, extremely wonderful, flexible program that is still too hard to use for many of these people.
Yeah.
And that's been hard to watch. Like I've watched, for instance, my mother, who wants to learn Hungarian, look at my stuff and be like, well, that's not for me, and just go back off. Yeah. And it's been clear from the start, like this could be better. And it's not that Anki is flawed in what it does. Anki is designed to be so flexible you can do anything in it. I mean, I learned how to write with Anki. I learned English style with Anki. Like you can do anything with Anki. But when you are restricting yourself to languages, then basically you have only one content type. You have sentences. Like all languages are composed of sentences. And so if you know what your content type is, if you know that that's the only thing you're really memorizing, then you can make an app that takes care of everything. I mean, where the only thing it does is asks you for your choices. You know, which image do you want for white? Which image do you want for, you know, the cat is in the box? You know, which image do you want for in? Uh-huh. And just automatically spits out tons and tons of flashcards based on sentences, automatically gives you sentences to learn that seem interesting, gives you the ability to put in your own sentences as you wish and customize your language learning experience, but still knock out all that busy work of needing to like in Anki right now, I have to literally select the word I want to learn, type __ to make a blank, like paste it in the next box. Like all of these steps are silly in some sense. Yeah. Because they can all be automated. And so the goal of this app is make something that you can use on your cell phone, where you can just browse through a language and be like, I like this word, bink. Here's some sentences, bink. I like this picture, dink. Do you want any more words in that sentence? Okay, dink. More pictures, dink. Here you have 20 flashcards.
So like you're literally taking out all of the dead wood from the creation process, the flashcard creation process. Fantastic. Yeah. Well, that sounds really exciting, man. And so Kickstarter is something that I've never really been involved in, but I have bought some things from Kickstarter before, and to check my understanding of it, Kickstarter is essentially where you say to people, hey, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to make, but I don't have the money for it. So come and support the project if you believe in it, and if we raise enough money, then you will get all this stuff to thank you for supporting it. Is that
Yes.
accurate, or have I missed it?
That's totally accurate. Yes. Basically, you are sort of pre-ordering things, and you are sort of just saying, I pledge my support, and I know that I will get a reward for the support. The other sort of key ingredient of Kickstarter, as opposed to other crowdfunding platforms, is that it's an all or nothing system, where you basically say, hey, if I don't make this much money, there's not enough to make this app, so there's no risk here. Like, basically, if we don't make enough money to make the app and you get your cool things, then you won't be charged, I won't get any money, and we'll just sort of not make this app. And we can talk about maybe trying again in the future. So
Which is actually quite a cool,
all or nothing thing is nice.
It's actually quite a cool system, right? Because then if people don't support it, then that actually tells you, well, actually, maybe this is not something that
exactly
people want in the first place. Cool. So
that was a big question from the start, was like, I want it. I don't know how much you all want it. So this is the test. It's like, do you want it this much? Like, let's find out.
Let's find out. So when is the deadline, and where do people go if they are interested in supporting the project?
Cool. The deadline is September 19th. That's not the deadline. The start is September 19th at 4 p.m. UK time. It is a 30-day project, so I believe it ends on the 18th of October. The probably easiest way to get to it is to go to Kickstarter.fluent-forever.com. We'll have a redirect that just gets you to wherever you need to be. Right now, if you go to Kickstarter.fluent-forever.com, it'll send you to our preview page. That preview page will allow you to sign up on a mailing list. Those people who are on that mailing list, we're basically doing a whole bunch of giveaways right now. Apparently, Kickstarters are all about the first hour. Like, if you can raise the maximum amount of money in the first hour, it will just jump on the front page and then earn an insane amount of money. Basically, we're telling everyone on the mailing lists that if you do this in the first hour, we're giving you 3 months of access to this app. Just free stuff.
The calendar reminder to set on your phone is September the 19th at 4 p.m. UK time, which is probably Eastern. What's that going to be? 12 p.m. midday Eastern Standard Time, 9 a.m.
I think it's 10. I think it might be 10 Eastern.
We'll check this, and we'll put it in the show notes, which I'll mention at the end of the episode, or in the description for those of you watching on YouTube. So, well, man, I think it's a fantastic idea. I can't wait to try it out. Wish you the best of luck with it. For those people who would like to find you elsewhere, your website is fluent-forever.com.
Yes.
Social media, where should people go?
There's a Fluent_Forever Twitter. There's a Fluent Forever Tips Instagram. All this stuff is sort of available for, like, the website's kind of the way to start. That'll send you everywhere else you need to go.
Go to fluent-forever.com and follow the links from there. Cool, man. Well, I've really enjoyed this chat. I feel like there are at least 10 different areas that we could have jumped on and gone
for
down.
Sure.
We'll have to do a repeat at some point and see if we can get into some of those areas in more detail. But,
I'll be happy to.
But thanks very much for the chat, and talk to you very soon.
Yeah.
And best of luck with the Kickstarter.
Thank you.